Welcome back to Novelio. Today is Wednesday, May 5th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. Jenna Fry was descending the stairs the next morning and heard Robert hollering for some of the servants as he entered the hall. Since he did not usually sound so harsh and angry, she immediately went to find out what was happening. She was disturbed but not terribly shocked to discover Catherine's father had the temerity to enter the grounds and demand an audience with his daughter. He was thrown off the property, naturally, but Robert was still incensed. When he explained what had happened, he asked Jennifer not to say anything to Catherine. "I worry for her well-being. She's very frightened of the man, and for good cause. I do not want her to know about this. I don't want her peace shattered, as it is likely the first she's known in years." "I understand," said Jennifer. "Sometimes I think how fortunate we are to have been born to loving parents, even though sadly you and Julian never knew our mother." "Yes, a far better upbringing than that hell on earth Catherine went through. I still must retrieve her younger siblings from that man's household without having the law fetched on me." He smiled ruefully. "Catherine slipped away to meet them when he was in Barston, and she told me they seemed well and that Blake had not become physically abusive, but the day will come, and they must be brought here before it does." During supper that night, the conversation naturally ended up on that all-consuming subject. "There was trouble ever since Buckingham's murder in 1628, Julian said. "Some didn't want to see it and turned away, and look where we are now." "Yes," said Robert, "and the king's perpetual disagreement with his ministers has gone since before that." "Since before you were born, Catherine." Catherine had been out to wave her hands to the balcony for the minstrels to begin, but was too intrigued with the conversation to do so. "Kings are continuously at odds with their ministers, though," Richard said. "Yes," Catherine interjected, "but which king ever dismissed his parliament and governed without one for, how long was it, 10 years? "Yes, it was 10, almost 11 years, about. For the semblance of governing he did throughout that time, and since taxes upon taxes to fund their indulgences. The king has never been willing to change," said Richard. "And now his kingdom will be lost at one of these dreary battles," Julian replied. "He must have known he could not reign forever without the good will of his people," Catherine said. She was so immersed in the topic that she forgot she was speaking to the man she despised. This intrigued Julian greatly, who was constantly impressed with her intellect, albeit against his will. "He hardly cares for that," Julian said. "Even now he thinks he's divinely guided by God and concerns himself little with anyone else's approval." "Why did things not change in 1641 when he was forced to call Parliament, the Long Parliament, when the Triennial Act was passed?" Catherine asked. Robert purposely caught Julian's eye, and his brother nodded slightly as if to say, "Yes, she's clearly intelligent. Don't goad me about it." "He only did so because he was desperate for money," Richard answered. "But the Act did state that Parliament must be called at least once every 3 years and could not be dissolved without their permission." "Well," said Jennifer, "it did little to help avert us from war. However, almost all agree that he is a good father, and he has come to peace with his queen. He was far from that in the beginning. It's more important to be a good king than a good father or husband," Julian said with finality. "You think being a good king to subjects is more important than being a good father to one's own children?" Catherine asked. Julian began to answer, but Robert cut him off, realizing, of course, what Catherine would be sensitive to such a statement. "I believe they are equally important," Robert said earnestly. "Agreed," said Jennifer. "Although how can one enjoy being a good husband or father when we are at war? The war won't end until Parliament makes our laws. But if Parliament is primarily made up of Puritans, we'll soon find ourselves with another problem," Julian answered. Catherine agreed, but said nothing. The next evening was the night of their wedding celebration ball, and the room looked splendid. Flowering shrubs and potted palms had been brought in from outdoors and placed in an artistic fashion. The floor was polished with French chalk, and there was a dais at one end, and on the musicians. It was all very grand and awe-inspiring. Catherine looked spectacular in her costume as Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Robert, looking every bit the part of Leon Battista Alberti, was the perfect foil to Catherine's garments. When Catherine had pointed out that they were entirely different periods, Robert had said the more differences the better, as it would make it more interesting. "So you have become a Renaissance man then, brother," Juliet said to Robert, who chided his twin for refusing to wear an outfit for the ball. His mode of dress revealed excellent taste and natural elegance, but he tended to roll his eyes in disdain at masquerades and couldn't be bothered to work out a costume. "Lizette will be most put out. She is a very unconvincing Anne Boleyn, despite the extraordinary black wig, and I think she was secretly hoping you would come as Henry VIII. I wonder if she remembers that Henry chopped off Anne's head in the end," Julian replied dryly, and Robert smiled. Later, Julian came upon Catherine. "You are most definitely the belle of the ball, Cathy." She smiled in response, but immediately began formulating a plan to disengage from any conversation. She saw his gaze steal over her costume and was well aware that he was assessing her, and for what purpose. Indeed, her costume showed a bit more than she was accustomed to and drew attention to her willowy yet flawlessly proportioned figure. "I was hoping you would like to dance. I am trying to escape the clutches of Lizette for the moment." "I shouldn't think you would want to dance with such a schemer." "There you are, darling," came Lizette's voice from behind her. Catherine gave Julian a somewhat triumphant smile and muttered, "Excuse me," just as Lizette approached. Julian was inwardly aggravated, but etiquette demanded he greet her as though he were at least somewhat happy to see her. "Come dance with me, Julian. The other men bore me." "And you bore me," he thought, but tried not to let his expression give it away. Normally he hated having to attempt to fit conversation to dance steps, but thought how he would not have the problem with Lizette. If he daydreamed the entire time, he would have missed nothing. "All right," he said, "let's get along then." Julian was unimpressed with Lizette and wanted little to do with her, although on the surface it looked as if they were very much alike. Ultimately, however, their only common characteristics were superficial ones, an air of self-absorption and a conscious arrogance in their carriage. Whose outrageous idea was it to have a wedding celebration in the form of a masquerade ball? Lizette asked. Was it the adventuress herself? Robert would be displeased to hear his wife described in such a way, Lizette. Despite his verbal entanglements with Catherine himself, he thought it was in the poorest of taste for Lizette to make such a comment to Robert's brother in their own home. "I'm surprised you defend her when she clearly cares nothing for you," Lizette replied. "And how is it that you know the inner workings of another person's mind?" "Well, she was hardly staring at you with adoration when I approached, when she was only too pleased to excuse herself. Perhaps she's just overwhelmed by my charm and was about to swoon," he replied, hoping to make himself obnoxious enough for even Lizette to be repelled. "Well, most women are that. Anyway, no matter about her. What I would like to know is when you're going to get married like Robert and settle down and produce an heir for Briarwood. Rather personal questions, are they not?" "Oh, don't be silly, Julian. I have worshipped you every moment since our first meeting, and Paul has become almost like another brother to you. I should think I can say whatever I like." She smiled at him in a way that was meant to be flattering but had no effect on him. He ignored her and gazed over her head as Catherine and Robert joined the dancing. He was not the only one who watched, as the pair made a striking picture in the room. Robert, over 6 feet tall like himself, had an inviolable distinction during such occasions, and Catherine was as graceful and flawless as someone who was trained in the dance for a lifetime. He wondered where she acquired the skill, as it seemed incongruous that such talent could be attained in a blacksmith's shop. He did not know that Catherine's mother was once an actress and dancer on the stage, and that Catherine was indefatigable with regard to learning all the steps. She had practiced on her own, and she and Christopher danced for their mother when Blake was away. Julian studied her extraordinary form and wished he was the one across the room with her, and Robert was burdened with Lisette. "You're not listening to anything I am saying," Lisette whined suddenly. "I'm sorry," said Julian. "I was temporarily distracted by the new dance. I fear I do not have the steps quite mastered." "You don't fool me," Lisette said slyly. "Your eyes are all over your sister-in-law. I believe you are secretly in love with her." "You are ridiculous," Julian said, becoming weary with her silly prattle. And still he watched Catherine's exquisite form across the floor. "That's how she and I would look dancing together," he thought to himself, secretly amused at his own observation. "Well, speaking of romances, what do you think about this stunt of your brother's? It must have maddened you to know that it was already finished and there was nothing to be done," she said. "I don't think Robert would care to have his marriage referred to as a stunt, Lisette," Julian replied rather tersely, even though that was exactly how he himself had described it to Robert. "Oh, darling, you know what I mean. Marrying so far down and not even discussing it with the family first. I know you adore each other, but even you have to admit it is outrageous." He looked at her fully then, wondering if she ever stepped down from the lofty heights of her aristocratic background for a simple conversation. Although he expressed outrage himself for supposedly the same reason, he knew deep down there was another basis for his fury, as he was never as fixated with class as were people such as Lisette. "What on earth did Lord Bradshaw say?" Julian hesitated. It was not Lisette's business, and he resented the fact that she thought he would repeat personal family conversations to her. He understood full well that it was her way of acting as if he were her beau and trying to place things on a too familiar level. Nevertheless, he suddenly felt the need to taunt her. "My father was pleased with the match. As a matter of fact," he replied, "and I would refrain from referring to it as marrying down if he or Robert are in earshot." "I know you are lying now. Even if you are not still enraged yourself, I know very well Lord Bradshaw must be furious." "He was not. After all, it's high time one of us marry, and it certainly won't be me." "Well, truly you cannot mean to never marry. After all, it is your obligation to give Briarwood an heir, as you are the oldest." "Could you be more obvious, Lisette?" "A ridiculous statement. And why is that, darling?" Lisette replied, tipping her face up to his in what he knew she thought was a seductive manner, but which did nothing to arouse his interest in her. "We are twins born less than 10 minutes apart, and as Robert is married to a young wife, I am quite certain I will be under no obligation to produce an heir. It's just as well as I never intend to marry." This last part he said with a dazzling smile, and even though Lisette seethed, she could do nothing but smile back. Later, as Julian made his way down the upstairs hall, he heard voices, and turning in the direction of them, recognized one as Catherine. He could not immediately distinguish the other, but it was familiar. Then he heard her say, "Sir Lambarth, please. They will be missing me at the ball. I must ask you to—" So Julian said, after rounding the corner and observing the scene in front of him, "Poaching on another man's land, Damien?" "Oh," Catherine said with utter relief, and Sir Lambarth abruptly turned around to find himself face to face with Lord Bradshaw's son. Catherine froze, unsure of what to do or say next, and she could tell Julian was livid. "I would ask for an explanation, Damien, but what could you possibly say?" "Come now, Julian, you have never, to my knowledge, interfered with whatever scandalous behavior takes place at your parties. I don't know why this should interest you so much." Julian looked at him in disgust, as he was clearly drunk. "And besides," but the sentence was never finished, as Julian suddenly backed him against the wall with such force that Catherine believed he may have been injured. She was relieved and terrified at the same time, as Julian's temper always frightened her, and yet she was grateful he was there, dealing with drunken fool. "Julian!" she exclaimed. "Please, I am not hurt." The man looked startled and frightened, and all at once a bit sober. "Did this despicable wretch of a man lay hands on you?" Julian said, effortlessly restraining the much smaller man against the wall. Indeed, the scoundrel looked almost delicate when compared with either twin. However, fearing violence and not wanting to see it, whatever the cause or reason, Catherine pleaded with him again. Truly, he did not touch me. No harm was done. Julian released him suddenly and shoved him towards the staircase. You need to control your temper, Sir Lambert shouted as he caught his balance and straightened his clothes. If you do not learn to be less aggressive, people will think you are mad. And you need to learn to hold your drink or refrain from imbibing if you want to be welcomed in this home again. Julian replied, Go back to your own woman or you will be the worse for it. I am not a good person to have as an enemy. Julian turned to Catherine and thought she looked deadly pale. In truth, she was not sure which man frightened her more. Are you telling me the truth? Did that lout lay a hand on you? He demanded, watching him scuttle away. No, he did not. I'm sure the cider was at least to some extent responsible for his behavior. It was strong, Julian. He perhaps did not know how strong this batch was. We knew it was from the first sip. It is no excuse, said Julian. I'm going to speak to Robert. Oh no, please do not do that. It will only upset him, and he will likely go do a mischief to that man, and it will spoil everything for us. I want this to be a night to remember. Please don't tell him. I am no worse for it, as you came upon me before he had a chance to do anything, if indeed he had planned to. Julian hesitated, frowning. And if Robert finds out another way and discovers that I knew and said nothing, what then? But how should he come to know? Catherine said. Sir Lambert will certainly not tell him. She laughed a bit in an attempt to lighten the mood. And the only others who know are you and I do not intend to say anything. Please, Julian. Have done. I shall say nothing, he said, still furious. That man is going to be watched from now on, though, he said, still exasperated. He preferred to tell Robert, but realized that virtually any woman would probably feel the same about having the evening spoiled. I think you could stand a strong drink yourself, Julian said as they walked toward the staircase. Perhaps, she admitted, I hope nothing shows on my face. He opened his mouth to tell her that things rarely showed on her face and to ask her why, but thought better of it. When they reached the landing, she turned to him and made the perfunctory thanks, and then suddenly said, Julian, are you so incensed because the incident took place under your roof, or because it took place with me? He looked at her quizzically for a few seconds. Because he dared it with you, obviously. Secondly, because it took place under our roof. Why? I was simply curious, she answered quickly, far too quickly. He knew then that she had a specific reason for asking that he felt he should have been able to figure out. Finally, he shrugged and walked back toward a group of their guests. He later found out to his amusement that Lisette had come with Damien. To deserve each other, he thought. There were still no great ties of affection between Catherine and Julian in the coming days, but she held him in greater regard after that evening's encounter, for both his assistance and his willingness to keep the incident between them. At the end of the night, Carinza and Catherine were on their way up the staircase, and Carinza remarked at how no one could take their eyes off Catherine at the ball. Catherine thanked her and tried to think of a way to return the compliment, but Carinza had not donned a costume for the event and stayed on the periphery as she always did on such occasions. Everyone was certainly drawn to you. You apparently could have chosen anyone in Cornwall when you decided to get married. Once again, Catherine could not quite work out whether Carinza was conversing normally or being somewhat facetious by implying that Catherine's marriage was contrived. However, Catherine remembered how the mottled looking-glass appeared to distort Carrie's face that first night, and she wondered if she was merely carrying over that feeling to everything she said and did now. Well, what happened between Robert and I was natural. I was not really setting out to get married. Before her companion could answer, she went on. You should have worked out a costume. I would have helped you, but was immediately concerned that she sounded condescending, which was not her intention. No one would notice me either way, so it seemed of little importance. It's clear that you think so, but I must respectfully disagree. You allow your shyness to keep you from engaging with people, because in truth you are quite attractive. Carinza replied at once, Thank you, but I doubt I would draw any suitors with so many truly beautiful women in the room. I am far past the age of coming out anyway. Well, you're hardly an old maid at 21, Carrie, but you continuously look for flaws in yourself and make sure you point them out to others, which is hardly the way to gain attention from anyone. I suppose, Carissa said non-committally. However, Catherine mentally sighed and tried to focus instead on the happiness of the occasion. Early the next morning, however, she awoke with a start from a strange and troubling dream. Julian, who was standing next to her, and suddenly said, "I am not a good person to have as an enemy," and the phrase kept echoing in her mind as she became fully awake. She tried to laugh, as she knew at once the source of the dream, but could not quite conjure up any mirth. Is he not indeed my enemy, though?" she whispered into the near darkness. "Why am I so afraid of this man? Nothing he's done has been bad enough to give me nightmares." "Kathy, my love, what is it?" Robert stirred. "I'm sorry, darling. 'Tis just a dream." "And the enemy in the dream?" "Julian, of course. It was just a dream, and yet... Oh, Kathy, love, you worry too much. He is most certainly not your enemy. I must ask you to trust me about that. He is merely unsettled because I believe he's a bit in love with you himself. Alas, I have no remedy for that," and Catherine could feel him smiling as he drew her into his arms. "I think you are wrong. I think he positively hates me." "No. Of all the emotions he may feel, I can promise you that hate is not one of them. He is a difficult man to know. I had a head of start of some 30 years. His personality is overbearing at times, and that creates a bleak situation for you, but it will all come right in the end." Later, as they descended the staircase for breakfast, Catherine said, "Speaking of your brother, I saw Lizette positively throwing herself at him last night." "She's getting desperate," Robert laughed. "She's a very attractive lady. I can't imagine she would be desperate. She's determined long ago it would be one of us, and now with me out of reach, she wants to snatch Julian before someone else does. Little does she know he does not like her any more than I do. He is also determined never to marry. He can be a bit of a philanderer at times, although he is not as bad as he was in our younger years. At any rate, Lizette never appealed to us either way. She is shallow and sometimes mean of temperament, although that may sound unkind. Nay, the truth is the truth." Just then Carissa walked into the hall, and Catherine went to see what she had planned for supper, and to tell her of an interesting dessert she'd come up with. Ever since the first dinner party, however, Carissa seemed to retreat even further into the background and expressed little or no interest in domestic affairs now that Catherine was still there. Still cautious, Catherine watched carefully for any signs of resentment, but Carissa seemed well contented in her still room. At length, Catherine decided that if she was taking a tiresome chore away from the young woman, she would be more than happy to continue to do so. She certainly got along much better with Sarah than Carissa did, which immediately created more harmony regarding the running of the household.